You think centuries-old dusty tomes can't surprise you. Then someone auctions off a kingdom, yes, a whole empire, as if it's a vintage painting. That's where our story begins. In the fog of early 19th century Europe, an obscure duchy no one had ever heard of appears on the auction block. Nobles and speculators crowd in, curious, half disbelieving. They whispered the name Burgundreth, a speck of a realm nestled between bigger powers. Barely maps take notice, yet rumors say its ruler is bankrupt. His debts are towering like thunderheads, and he's willing to sell his crown literally for a pile of sovereigns. Here's where it gets strange. The auction isn't held in some grand hall. It's a courtyard behind a crumbling chateau under grey skies. Portraits of long-gone dukes stare down at bidders wearing polished boots. A clerk reads out property deeds, rights, titles. Bidders jostle, murmuring, calculating. One wealthy banker from Vienna waves a handkerchief for attention. Another noble from Prague adjusts his hat. Stakes feel absurdly surreal. You'd expect political outrage. Instead, there's tacit acceptance. Foreign ministers glance the other way. Press is barely present. It's as if buying an empire by auction crown is a grown-up version of purchasing an exotic curio. Here's the most confounding twist. The duchy's inhabitants barely seem to care. Farmers, townsfolk, shepherds, they continue daily chores. Grazing sheep, church bells, gossip at the tavern, political upheaval. They shrugged, as though trade winds changed course, and life simply tilted with them. The winning bid comes from a merchant banker with nothing but ambition in his pockets. He pays gold, seals papers, receives the ducal seals, coat of arms, a tiny royal court including a disgruntled chamberlain and a symbolic key to a castle. He hasn't spoken one word directly to his new subjects, who don't know whether to call him Your Grace or Sir. But there's a twist. The auction includes a clause oddly specific that the buyer must guarantee pensions, uphold local laws, protect serfs. It's an early form of social contract, tucked inside a contract. The seller, desperate, scrawled in faded ink, "Empire passes, but obligations stand." That detail transforms this from financial oddity into moral maze. Imagine the merchant banker pacing in candlelit nights, holding brittle parchments, disoriented by duties he never rehearsed for. The townsfolk whisper, "This new lord doesn't know us, him." The air hums with questions. Can paper titles birth loyalty? Can obligations outweigh opportunity? Is ownership enough to claim a soul of a realm? I'll admit I used to think this sounded like farce. But the documents exist. Lobby records, ledger entries, letters from local priests. They trace a bizarre 9-day rule. 9 days, during which he effectively reigned, before joining a diplomatic frenzy to offload the title for profit. Yes, this emperor lasted less than a week. That's why he's the 9-day emperor. It reads like myth, but ledger stains don't lie. During those 9 days, he only made one proclamation, a freeze on grain prices, aimed at appeasing peasants. That's it. Then he vanished. A courier delivered his abdication letter, stamped, and waited. The chapels rang bells, the farmers tilled fields. Nobles grumbled at billiard tables. And another chapter of this strange saga began, one that involves secret financiers, hidden alliances, and a conspiracy inside the court chapel. But that's part 2. 9 days. That was all he had. But when the merchant banker woke in his new castle on the first morning of his reign, the weight of centuries seemed to press against the shutters. The air was damp, the corridors cold. Somewhere deep in the stone halls, a servant coughed, and the echo rolled like a cannonball. His empire might be small, but the silence was enormous. He had inherited not just a title, but a puzzle. Every ledger he touched crumbled under his fingers, revealing debts buried like rot under floorboards. The treasury chest contained less gold than a successful merchant might keep in his own counting house. The royal guard numbered barely 20 men, most of them older than their muskets. And yet the documents he'd signed gave him legal claim over it all and people, and the expectation of stability. Here's where the oddity deepens. His court, if it could be called that, was a patchwork of holdovers from the previous duke's reign. There was the chamberlain, bitter as black coffee, who refused to look him in the eye. A chaplain who spoke more in parables than plain language. A cook who insisted on preparing meals as if rationing for a siege. They watched him with an air of quiet judgment, as though the empire itself were waiting to see if he'd crack. He spent his first days pacing between the Great Hall and a cramped study, shuffling through treaties, land grants, and military rosters. Messengers arrived with petitions written in looping script, disputes over grazing rights, accusations of stolen grain, demands for debt forgiveness. In a world where kings might measure their power in armies, his was measured in cattle counts and the grain market. But the real trouble began on the third day. A delegation of local merchants requested an audience. They entered the hall in stiff silence, hats in hand. Their spokesman, a wiry man with a voice like dry reeds, asked for assurances that trade routes would remain open. Behind the polite words was an unmistakable edge. Without stability, the market would wither, and with it, the duchy's last trickle of revenue. The emperor promised to keep the peace. He even issued a decree freezing grain prices to calm the peasants. It was meant as a gesture of goodwill. Instead, it sparked resentment among the landowners, who muttered about losses and the arrogance of a man who had never planted a seed in their soil. By the fifth day, the tension thickened. Rumors drifted into the castle like smoke whispers that foreign envoys had arrived in nearby towns, speaking quietly to discontented nobles. The emperor noticed the chamberlain disappearing for long stretches, returning with eyes that avoided his. Even the chaplain seemed to measure his sermons for double meanings. And here's the part history almost forgets. The emperor knew he was in trouble. He wasn't naive. By the sixth day, he had already sent discreet letters to bankers in Vienna and Paris, exploring the possibility of selling his claim. It was a reversal so swift it would make a coin spin. But in his mind, this wasn't cowardice, it was survival. An empire you can't hold is nothing more than a debt you're forced to carry. The days shortened, the halls grew colder, and the sense of being a guest in his own court deepened. On the eighth night, a courier arrived under cover of darkness. He carried a sealed letter from a neighboring power offer and a warning. The empire was worth more as a bargaining chip than a kingdom. And in politics, bargaining chips don't live long. By morning, the merchant banker turned emperor had made his decision. He would abdicate before someone made the choice for him. He called in the chamberlain, dictated the terms, and sealed the document. His reign had begun in uncertainty, and it would end in quiet retreat. The ninth day dawned with the sound of bells. Not in celebration, but in announcement. The empire had a new claimant, and the old one had vanished into the fog. What happened to him after he left the castle's gates is where the story takes its sharpest and most dangerous turn, and that's where part 3 begins. The fog had barely lifted from the cobblestones when the bells fell silent. The 9-day emperor was gone, and in his place came whispers of a man whose shadow reached across the empire's borders, Lucius Septimius, Severus. In Rome, news traveled like wildfire through dry grass. The Senate's throne was empty, and with it came the ancient itch for power. Severus, commander of the Pannonian legions, didn't wait for formalities. He heard the rumors. A weak claimant had seized the purple, then lost it before the ink on his decrees had dried. It was the kind of instability that drew generals like sharks to blood. Severus moved fast. From the banks of the Danube, he summoned his troops, battle-hardened men with armor dented from real fights, not ceremonial parades. Orders rang out, tents were struck, and the great iron river of soldiers began to flow south toward Rome. Every town they passed heard the drumbeat before they saw the banners. Children climbed onto rooftops for a glimpse. Merchants closed shutters. Old veterans saluted from doorways. Here's where the air changes. The march wasn't a reckless charge. It was a performance. Severus knew the value of spectacle. His columns were arranged in perfect symmetry, cavalry flanking like wings of a predator, standards glinting in the sun. He sent letters ahead to cities along the route, promising fair treatment to those who opened their gates and ruin to those who resisted. It was a campaign fought as much with ink and rumor as with swords. By the time they reached the Po Valley, the countryside was already bending to him. Local governors swore loyalty, offering supplies and coin. In the markets, people spoke his name with the same mix of fear and admiration they used for ancient conquerors. Even before he saw Rome's walls, Severus had gathered enough legitimacy to claim he was the empire's salvation. Meanwhile, in the capital, panic seeped into the marble halls. The Senate debated until their voices cracked. The city's garrison was small, more ceremonial than battle-ready, and the Praetorian Guard, supposed elite protectors, were eyeing the wind to see which way it blew. Many still remembered how easily they had sold the throne days earlier. Loyalty, here, was a negotiable currency. The man now sitting on the imperial seat knew his position was paper-thin. Didius Julianus, senator, turned accidental emperor, tried to buy Severus's allegiance with titles and promises. But Severus didn't march hundreds of miles to be someone's subordinate. His messages were curt. Lay down your claim, and you may live. By late spring, Severus's legions were crossing the Apennines. Every step closed the distance between him and the city, and with it, the Senate's options. Rumors painted him as a military genius, a ruthless tactician, and a man who never forgot an insult. Those who knew him well said he could be patient, but only when patience served the kill. Here's where it turns from tense to inevitable. The Praetorian Guard, calculating their odds, began secret talks with Severus's envoys. The deal was simple. Open the gates, hand over Julianus, and keep their lives. Betrayal in Rome wasn't a crime, it was a survival strategy. On the morning Severus reached the city, the streets were eerily quiet. No battle was fought. No siege engines rolled. The gates swung open, as if the hinges had been waiting for his touch. His army poured in with the discipline of a tide, not a riot. Citizens watched from balconies as Severus rode at the center, his face unreadable beneath the crest of his helmet. Within hours, Didius Julianus was gone, history says executed, though the details blur into rumor. The throne was empty again, and Severus sat where the 9-day emperor had never dreamed of being, at the heart of Rome, with the legions at his back. But the march was only the first move. 3 rivals still claimed the right to rule, and Severus intended to outlast them all. How he dismantled each one is where this story sharpens into something even stranger, and that's where part 4 begins. Severus now sat on the throne, the city bending to his will. But the seat, he claimed, was still warm from the man he had just removed, Didius Julianus, the emperor who had bought the crown from the Praetorian Guard and worn it for barely 2 months. For the 9-day emperor, that bizarre auction had been a footnote. For Julianus, it was the beginning of the end. Once Severus entered Rome, there was no theatre, no drawn-out trial. The Senate, sensing which way the wind blew, quickly declared Julianus a public enemy. The man who had outbid rivals for an empire now faced the oldest currency in politics, a clean removal. Accounts say the execution was swift. Julianus met the sword with the fatal calm of someone who had gambled high and lost. He was buried quietly, without the pomp he had tried to buy. But Severus's rise didn't happen in a vacuum. Across the empire, 2 other generals, Pescennius Niger in the east and Clodius Albinus in the west, also claimed imperial authority. Rome was suddenly a chessboard with 3 kings, and Severus knew the game couldn't end in stalemate. He moved against Niger first, marching east with the same relentless precision that had brought him to Rome. Battles flared in Asia Minor. Cities were sieged, and by the end of it, Niger was dead, his head displayed as a warning. Then Severus turned on Albina. Their alliance, if it could even be called that, collapsed under ambition. In Gaul, Severus crushed Albinus's forces in a brutal, decisive clash. When the dust settled, Severus was the sole ruler, his rivals erased from both power and the official record. And yet, the ghost of that auction still haunted the city. The spectacle of selling the throne to the highest bidder had burned into the public memory. It was more than embarrassment, it was a scar on the dignity of Rome. The Praetorian Guard, whose greed had started it all, was reshaped under Severus's watch. He stripped them of their power to choose emperors, filling their ranks with his own loyal veterans. The days of imperial auctions were over. For the 9-day emperor, the man at the heart of that first bizarre sale, the trail, goes cold. Some sources say he lived out his life quietly in obscurity, the title, a strange story he never told at dinner tables. Others suggest he met a quieter, but no less certain end, erased like so many political inconveniences. His reign, if it can be called that, is remembered not for what he did, but for what it symbolized. How quickly power can be transferred when loyalty is for sale. Severus would rule for nearly 2 decades, expanding Rome's borders, reforming its military, and leaving behind a dynasty. But even his legacy is tangled with the moment he walked through those gates without a fight. His reign began not with a war, but with a transactioner, political debt someone else had paid with their life. It's tempting to see the 9-day emperor as a trivial figure, a historical curiosity wedged between bigger names. But there's something sharper hidden in his story. In 9 days, he went from buyer to ruler to fugitive. His title was paper, his authority an illusion. And when the tide turned, no gold could buy him another chance. Today, it's easy to think of power as permanent, of positions as solid once claimed. But his story is a reminder that sometimes the most fleeting reigns leave the longest shadows. In politics, in business, even in our own lives, holding the crown means little if the ground beneath you is already shifting. After all, an empire sold can be taken back just as quickly, and history rarely remembers the buyer's name.